right, everyone. Thanks for tuning into the Sports Card Therapist, where I give you a behind the scenes look at my hobby hustle and sprinkle in some self care and wellness on top of that. I'm Rob Gerard, your Sports Card Therapist. And whether if you're listening to me on iTunes, Spotify, or watching on YouTube, welcome to the podcast. And I am excited about today's episode. This is going to be actually roundtable number 7 of the month of roundtables in December, episode 131 for whoever is keeping track. And this is going to be episode, the name of this episode is Vintage 101. So it's the Vintage 101 roundtable. And, before I jump into it, though, I just want to thank everyone who has continued to tune into the roundtables. I talked a little bit about it on, I've been the last 2 Saturdays actually dropped like surprise episodes, but they've been kind of quick. They've just been like my weekly reflection because there's been so much going on with the roundtables that like happen behind the scenes, ahead of the scenes, in front of the scenes kind of thing. It's like I kind of want to process that stuff and give people a peek behind the curtain as to like what it was like to set it up. So if you're listening to this on Monday or at any point, during the week, on Saturday's weekly reflection, I'm sure you'll hear about how this vintage chat came about and all that good stuff. So, but yeah, the feedback that I got on the $500 and less, building your PC at $500 and less, that aired last week, which was roundtable number 5 and episode 128, I believe, was an incredible episode. So I knew we were going to have a vintage roundtable already kind of planned and going. And with Matthew, who's on the panel today, he actually threw out something that was along those lines of really an entry point into vintage. So that was something that I was hoping we could tackle today. So without any further ado, we're gonna throw it out to the panel, the roundtable guests, however it is you want to call it. They are back like they never left, back for the second time as a whole unit. I want to welcome you guys. Thank you guys for coming on, man. It's awesome to see you again.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks, Rob. It's good to have the band back in town.
The band's back together, baby. One night only. So if you guys want to go around, if you want to just introduce yourself and give your Instagram, Twitter, if you own a card shop, whatever information you want to give out, feel free. And Steve, we can start with you.
All right, sure. Steve, it's Vintage Slabman on IG, longtime collector, vintage baseball, pretty much focused, but some other vintage sprinkled in there. And then a lot of like signed stuff, memorabilia type ones and stuff like that. Yeah.
Sure. So, hey guys, I'm Sports Card Pete, also known as Pete. I'm mostly a pre-war vintage baseball card collector. So Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, but I also dipping my toes in kind of some of the more vintage basketball, post-war baseball, and some modern goats such as Wayne Gretzky or Michael Jordan.
So I'm Matthew, 1956 Tops guy on Instagram. Also go by Ignatius J. Riley on Net54 and the Blowout forums. So I'm a vintage collector, but I also am big Cubs collector. So I also do some modern, like collect the 2016 World Series champions team, but do a lot of 1956 Tops, do a lot of vintage cards, and really happy to be here again.
Matthew, let me ask you a question. Do you have any Bartman memorabilia?
No, I don't. I've thought about getting a ticket, before like tickets exploded. I was like, oh, that would be a cool ticket to have, but I do not have any Bartman memorabilia.
Man, you had to go there, Rob. You just had to have
well, you know what? I probably wouldn't have gone there if they didn't win in 16.
It's kind of okay now.
Exactly. If they didn't finally win, I wouldn't have even gone there. I wouldn't have done it. So, all right, Adam.
Okay, Adam at Wise Guy Sports Cards on Instagram. Mainly a pre-war collector at this point. I started off doing various sets in the 50s, vintage rookies, things like that, but have sort of aged, matured, whatever you want to call it, migrated mostly to pre-war. But definitely excited to get into 101. I feel like Billy Madison right now, going back to school to show Dad I'm not a fool.
Yo, absolutely. And thank you guys again for coming back. Same thing with the episode that you guys were on a couple of months ago. Got such an incredible reaction, got great feedback from the episode. People, I think, just love the idea of vintage, but I think that vintage can be a very overwhelming thing if you are not too familiar with it. I think, like, first of all, what's considered vintage, what's not considered vintage, and I know we'll probably touch on just a couple quick things that we might have touched on a few months ago when you guys were on. But I think the first thing is, vintage, it's a pretty expensive venture, right? So, like, you kind of want to know what you're doing. Like, you want to dip it's like, for those that want to dip their toes in, I guess that's really what this comes to, because I have a lot of people who, approach me, especially since I've been putting out a lot of vintage episodes, recently in the last year or so. I've been pretty vintage heavy with my content, and people come up and they're like, yeah, I would, they see my cards and they're like, yeah, man, I love the cards. I'd love I'm thinking about maybe getting into vintage. And I'm like, well, you better know what you're doing. So that's kind of like, always my message. Like, don't just start buying vintage and try to learn as you go. It could be an expensive thing, but I feel like there's got to be some sort of entry level beginner stage to it, right? And I think that's kind of what I would like to cover. Like, can you check the boxes with vintage, or at least most of the boxes that you can check with modern? And I think that's kind of, where my head's at with that. Does Steve, you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that I think, in my mind, I think there's a little bit of a false perception there about just how expensive it is to start getting into vintage. Because if you see a lot of the price points that a lot of modern stuff is sold for, or various boxes or whatever that guys are buying, you could step into a lot of very nice vintage stuff for that price point. Yeah, you're not going to step into like a 52 tops mantle or something, but you could get a final Willie Mays card, let's say a 73 tops, a great looking card for 20, 40 bucks, 30, 50 bucks, so it doesn't always have to be cost prohibitive. If you're going for the showstopper cards, yeah, if you're going the big ticket things, but if you just want to get your feet wet and get some quality, nice looking vintage cards, you can really do that in any price range you're comfortable with and any budget you're comfortable with. I just
Yeah.
think as a vintage space in general, I think a lot of the long-term collectors and stuff like that, and just people in general, I think everyone needs to kind of focus on doing as good a job as we can as being good stewards towards that, and being approachable and accessible to help people learn and help people kind of get a comfort level and an understanding of how they can enter it and find like rewarding experiences with it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Steve. I think, it is true that there are plenty of good vintage cards that aren't going to, set you back thousands of dollars. And I think, one of the big advantages that vintage has is that, and we talked about this last time, is that it's so, you can really break away from needing to have like a 9 or a 10, right? You can really look at lower grade cards, and you can find, as long as you're not looking at like Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb, but you're looking at other Hall of Famers. Like, a lot of those cards are quite affordable, even in pretty nice grades. And what I would suggest to people is, you definitely don't want to start off by dropping a bunch of money, but you can, if you set aside like $100, $50, and then think about, what is it that's attracting you to vintage, and then think about, what kind of cards do you think you'd have a connection to, whether it's through a player, through a team, and then my advice would be, just start looking. Don't buy anything. Just kind of look around and see, like, what do you feel a connection to? What do you think looks cool? And don't really pay attention to like what other people think is cool or what they're chasing. Just really like reflect back on yourself and think about, what are the kinds of things that you can really connect with. And then you can really enter that space with not a lot of money and buy Hall of Famers from classic sets without dropping too much money.
Yeah, I totally agree. 100%. The last thing I would do is go all in and start spending a ton. I would probably hunt, like allow yourself a 2 to 3 week or month window of just researching and seeing what really resonates with you, and then maybe pulling the trigger on one card and kind of let that card marinate in your collection and you looking at it for a little while before you go to purchase number two, and just kind of see what is really striking and speaking to you about it.
So I kind of agree with both points from Steve and Matthew, right? So I think the one point is sometimes it's very hard to find what you're connected to, right? So Matt, like you like the Cubs, right? Sometimes people aren't even baseball fans, right? So they don't have a connection to any particular team, right? So my thought is that, do your homework, and sometimes I have this phrase like JTI, just try it. Like go buy the lowest grade something of a set. It doesn't have to be a Hall of Famer. So like an example, the T206 set. Just
Mm-hmm.
buy a common card for like $30. It's all wrinkled, and then get it in hand. It's like, oh, you know what? I actually don't like this. It's too narrow and it's too
Mm-hmm.
old. I don't want it to maybe go somewhere older. And you say, hey, let me buy something from the 1950s, and you kind of figure out like what you like. I feel like a lot of it is sometimes people get in their heads like, oh, this is vintage is so complicated. I think you just gotta like do your homework, go on eBay, look at prices, and just dip your toes in and see what kind of sets you like. The other issue with vintage is that most influencers on YouTube are mostly modern driven, and so for us folks, like I think we probably don't do as great of a job on the vintage side, kind of like um, giving people knowledge and making a learning curve a little bit easier. I think that's like something we should all have to work on. But I think there's still plenty of data out there to kind of give you the guidance for getting your toes wet in vintage. A lot of it's just trying it out.
And that goes to Steve's point about approachability, right? Like, people who do collect vintage on Instagram, you want to be. I've had a lot of people reach out to me, especially after we did the first roundtable. They just had like
Totally.
random questions about like, what's, does this card cool? What do you think about this price? And I think that that approachability is important for helping people like come up to speed, right? And you got people like Adam, right, who actually like sell a lot of cards, like go through just a lot of cards. And most vintage people are pretty chilled out, right? And they're very approachable and they love nerding it out about about the cards, right?
Yeah, I mean, I
Totally.
completely agree. I feel like a lot of vintage can be intimidating. The cards that make the headlines are your 52
Hmm.
panels. I mean, some of your early roots, your Gotti roots, which aren't particularly expensive. I mean, they're expensive. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
But there's this false perception maybe that all vintage, just because of the age, needs to be expensive, and that's
Yeah.
not the case. I mean, we think of even the 50 sets at this point, they're 70 years old. I mean, 60, 70 years old. So people think that a card that's 60 or 70 years old has to cost thousands of dollars, and that's not the case. I mean, even to Pete's point, talking about the T206s, which at this point are over 100 years old, they're 110 years old, and you can still buy cards within that set that are a couple $100 or less than that. I think a lot of just the entry point for vintage is difficult for a lot of younger people because obviously they didn't see these players play. And if
Hmm.
you don't sort of have an attachment to the players or history in itself, that nostalgia feel that really brings you to the vintage side just isn't really there. So I think to a lot of everybody's point, sort of spending time talking to people in the vintage community, doing your research, getting an education is very beneficial for you getting a foothold and really starting in the vintage market.
Yeah.
Because without really knowing the players, the teams, the history, you may not know what to go after. You may not know that there's affordable sets, even that are old, that you can buy a lot more respectably. So a lot of it is just really interacting with people in the vintage community. We're very approachable, like Matthew said. So just take a lot of time really to get an education and do your research.
I think one interesting entry point could be in I just listened to Rob's last podcast with the Women of the Hobby podcast, and one of the guests was talking about like why she's drawn to cards is art. And actually I think that that's where vintage offers just so much interest visually, right? Like you don't have to
Totally.
go back and like be a fan of this team, but literally if you go onto eBay and type in like T206, sort by like, soonest to end, you'll see some of the most like spectacular artwork you've ever seen on a card. And that's I mean, I would just if you're like a really person drawn to the visual aspect of cards, I think there are so many commons in vintage cards that look absolutely amazing, and I think that's a great way to try to approach it.
Oh yeah, totally. Do a Google search of images of vintage baseball cards on an image Google search, and just scroll through that. You'll see stuff that'll blow your mind, and some of those cards aren't worth much at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to follow up with what Steve, I think it was you that said that, and all well said, guys. You were talking about you could get your feet wet by buying a 73 maze, right? So I just looked up really quick on Card Ladder. That's usually where I go to look up my comps under sales history because with, and not that I'm trying to plug Card Ladder here, they don't pay me anything, but they're friends of the show. But they vet every single sale to make sure it was actually paid for. And I just went on Card Ladder and looked up 73 Willie Mays SGC3, which is it's a beautiful card. I mean, looks like it could have been a PSA 6 or 7 at one point, but there's an SGC3. You know how much it went for?
$25.
Yep, $21. $21.
That's
So
awesome.
you can get a 50-year-old Willie Mays card. I mean,
Best
this
player
thing
of
is
all time.
incredibly centered. It's incredibly centered. I mean, the corners look great. I'm like, that's a 3, but it went for $21.07 on eBay.
And so, Rob, I don't do anything on the modern space. I haven't bought a pack since 1990. What does a new premium pack or a pack cost on some baseball or basketball issue right now?
I
On
would
average.
You know what? I don't rip any wax at all. So I would imagine they'll probably, those super low end, like the super low end brands that won't ever really be worth much, probably go for about $8 to $10 a pack. And I think like maybe some of the mid end stuff goes for 15 to 25 a pack, I would imagine.
At like $20 though, you're like near like grading fee costs, right?
Yeah, but so like basically for more or less the price of one of those hanger packs at Target or something, you're having a piece of history and the final card, which I think that is another opportunity collecting wise, is the final cards of Hall of Famers or players with significant careers. That could be a great polar opposite to collecting rookie cards if you're on a budget. So grab their last
idea. I love that idea.
You could go down that rabbit hole and get started on a budget of getting the last issue of stellar players.
Wow. Yeah. And because I think when I think about ways to collect players that might not fully break the bank, I think immediately people go to their second year cards. Second year cards are sometimes like, okay, it still has some cachet there, and
which makes sense.
Yeah. But final year cards, it's like, could you imagine having like really, really nice eye appeal final year cards for like every Hall of Famer?
I think one thing that's cool too about final year cards is that you can look at the back, right, and you just see, like, if you look at the back of like 69 Mantle, right, you see, right, his whole like statistical history, which is that stuff that I love that kind of stuff.
It's like having a thesaurus or a dictionary right there, right, like right there on or an encyclopedia right there, I should say.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, Matthew. It's like you get all the stats, so you get the whole baseball reference line right there.
That's really cool.
The 1970s version of Google. I feel like I spend time every day looking up random career stats and players just to do comparisons and normalizations and things like that. So it's a very cool point when you think about it.
And you know what? Just to kind of plug last month's episode when Matthew came on the podcast, he talked about ways to really enjoy your cards, and we spent a significant amount of time talking about looking at the backs of your cards, and the backs of your cards, vintage, are a lot different than modern. I couldn't even really tell you what the backs of modern cards look like now that I think about it. I think a lot of them are like, it doesn't have a lot, because nowadays you're a lot of the high-end modern cards are usually either autographed or have patches in them. So it's almost like half of the space on the backs of these cards are just like white,
Or like
and then like
legal
in
words.
very small font and says like this player worn patch, so yeah, so I like that. So a nice entry point is, and you guys brought up some great phenomenal points. And you know what I was doing actually a few weeks ago? So every once in a while I found myself kind of going down these rabbit holes, and I was debating with someone who he's a big time card promoter out of New York. So shout out to John from Behind the Diamond out of he promotes shows on Long Island, and he's involved in a lot of stuff, and he always kind of will text me just to push my buttons. Like, that's like our friendship at this point. It's never like, hey man, how's the family? Like, he immediately starts texting me to push my buttons. So we started talking about the all-time great hitters, and and we're debating, who are the all-time great hitters, and he's bringing up names, I'm bringing up names, and then after we get done debating, I think like a day or two later, I'm like, let me like Google this. Let me Google who are the all-time best hitters, and there's all different kinds of lists and stuff. You know what I mean? But there's names that you do forget about, like Tris Speaker, Hornsby. It's like there's a lot of names like you forget about, or I should say I forget about until I start really re-educating myself. But that's a way that I think, when I'm thinking about who are the players that I want to put my money into, right? I mean, aside from the players that I have a connection with and I love, aside from those kind of players, like if I'm thinking of who's a new player that I can maybe start collecting that won't break the bank the way that Ruth or Ty Cobb or Mantle does, who's someone who might be a sneaky good buy who's vintage. And I like going down those lists. I love looking at lists, whether if it's the home run list. I mean, I love the all-time hits list, the hits list for pitchers, all-time strikeouts. And so that's always a fun way too, of not only educating myself on the history of these games that we love, but really considering where I want to take my collection next. Because I'll speak for myself, and I'm sure, some of you guys might identify, but my collection, I feel like I'm always kind of curating it. It's always, it's almost like water. Like there's always some kind of movement going on, whether if I'm buying something, I'm trading up into something, I'm selling something to get a bigger purchase. I think there's always movement going on, and my wheels are always spinning. It's like there's never a day where I'm not thinking about cards, and especially vintage. So so how do you guys go about figuring out how and who and what you want to collect?
So for me, it's been years, like 20 years of just trial and error, right? So I've gotten to a point now where
20 years of trial and error, you're only 25.
a lot of errors. No, well, I'm 33, right? So you figure like teenage, right? So but a lot of it's trial and error. So like Rob, to your point, when I was younger, like the T206, I could never get like a Ty Cobb, right, or a Cy Young. So I go for like a Christy Mathewson, I go for a Tris Speaker, I go for some of the commons, right? And you learn what you like, and then you'd go for a Mantle from the 60s versus like the 50s because you couldn't afford those. So I do agree with you. I guess the question, or like something that I've always debated, is if you're on a budget, right? Do you go for a higher end card from a more lower end player? So like maybe you do a nice T206 Tris Speaker, or do you go for like I don't know, a 1960s Mickey Mantle type cards? Like I guess because someone that's more well known, but maybe a lesser card or a less attractive thing. For me, it's always been go for the better player and maybe not the best issue. And so I've always stuck to that, right? So, for like Ty Cobb, I would get some of his more affordable issues because I really like the player versus going for something that's more higher end of a lower tier player.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. And going back to a bunch of the points that we've already brought up, like Matthew talked about sort of art and appreciating the look of the card and the aesthetics of the card. I'm a Clemente guy, and I wouldn't say that necessarily the 55 Clemente is my favorite card aesthetically. I really like the 66, and it's a later career Clemente, not as expensive as some of the early ones, but something about the image, the way that it looks, sort of really speaks to me. So you can buy that card at a higher grade than you would buy, let's say, the 55, the 56, 57 at a lower grade. And honestly, one of the hurdles getting into vintage, let's say you're coming from modern, is in vintage you want to have PSA 9s, PSA 10s, PSA 8s. And the vintage community really doesn't work that way necessarily. A lot of these cards you're not even able to find in those type high grades. So it's really important to really appreciate eye appeal and look for lower to mid grade cards that have great eye appeal versus sort of trying to buy those higher grade cards. It's just, that's definitely a hurdle that I see people getting into vintage, but it's definitely something that's able to be overcome.
Yeah, totally. I think I would recommend to anyone is to just set their initial budget on what they're comfortable with, because I always view my collection just like you were saying, Rob. It's kind of like an amoeba. It's always like changing shape and evolving, and things are moving along, and you lose an arm here and another one forms over here. It's like, so I would set your budget, and I would do bullet points on what you are liking in regards to Clemente. Okay, I like Clemente, and I really like, this was the year they won the series. I want a 71 or whatever, it's 72. And just try to work within that budget. Don't feel any type of peer pressure to stretch your budget, and don't buy anything based on what you see everyone else buying, or feel a sense of urgency based on what you're seeing other people doing, because vintage isn't so much of a momentum play like it is with a lot of the modern stuff. So I would just be pragmatic about it and not feel a peer pressure.
Steve, I just want to add one thing. I love that comment because I think the vintage market, like if you're starting out, play the long game, right? It's not going away, right?
Yep.
Like those cards are not going away. Like those people, the mantles will be iconic 30 years from now. There's no rush to like get these nice copies, like do your homework, whatever. The peer pressure thing is it's such a big topic that I've talked to people about, because Instagram and social media is good and bad. It's good because you interact with more people. It's bad because you see all these people post like these outrageous vintage cards on their feed and all these big pickups, and I bet some people, like myself included, are like, wow, like I don't have a card like that, like I want a card like that. And so you don't always think rationally, like that's not what it's all about. Like it's easy to get jealous or want to rush and feel pressure to get better cards, but you almost have to avoid that and realize, hey, like I need to play the long game, and eventually if I make smart choices, like 15, 20 years from now, those cards will be those cards people are like, wow, what a great choice.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Adam.
Oh, so you're not doing the prospecting on the NFL quarterbacks quite with vintage cards. You're not trying to buy Tua or Jalen Hurts sort of as he's playing well. So yeah, you can definitely take your time when it comes to it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I think about, how I make decisions, it's kind of like I go back to thinking about like what defines a collection, right? So a collection to me is like you can put all of your money into like one amazing card, but kind of by definition, like that's not a collection. That's like a card, right? So I try to think about my cards in terms of like projects, like different kind of themes that kind of bring cards together. And the amoeba aspect is kind of like, sometimes you just try it out. You're like, I've been collecting all of these Banks cards, but maybe I'll go back and try to get, a Cubs card from like, from the 1950, all the way back to T206, and just see where that goes. And sometimes it fails, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to sell these cards. The good thing about vintage is usually the pricing is pretty stable. But I try to think about it in terms of projects, and sometimes that pushes you in directions that maybe aren't necessarily like the best from like an investment point of view. But I usually view cards not as like an investment, but this is like a hobby. This is fun. I mean, I do try to like pay attention to what the values are, but I'm really trying to just enjoy myself. So I try to think about, okay, if I want to build a collection that makes sense thematically, even to someone who's outside of the hobby, what does that look like? And then I try to think about, okay, how much would it cost to kind of run out this project, and what would it look like, and what are the kind of cards that like make sense in that project? That's my thought process.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think to what you were saying, and what Pete was saying was like, just try it. The one nice thing about vintage is it's very forgiving as long
Mhm.
as you're buying the stuff at a reasonable price and you're not overpaying. Even if you decide you're not feeling that particular card you bought, you're going to be able to more than likely recoup what you invested in it. So you're really not out anything more than the time of the
Mhm.
learning process part there. Another thing is if you have a LCS or something in your area, local card shop, go through and just flip through some commons of some different sets and just see, like, hold a card that you bought for $2 in your hand, take it home and just feel it a little bit and just kind of get acquainted with the aspects of vintage that you like on there.
Yeah, and you guys are all making really good points. I just want to jump in and kind of touch on something that Pete said. Pete, because you really nailed it. And sometimes some people can kind of like state the obvious, but word it in a way to where it's like you've never heard it before, never thought about it. And I feel like that's what you did. You said when it comes to vintage, there's no rush. Really, just you're playing the long game. And I think that a lot of people in this hobby, there's a lot of the hobby, and it's so strange because when you're dealing with the vintage side of things versus the ultra modern, it could almost feel like two completely different hobbies. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some gray area in between that, overlaps where you have some people that are asking, some people that are the comp police, or some people that are always high on prices, or some people that are trying to take advantage. But for the most part, it could feel like two completely different hobbies, because with vintage, I've never had the feeling like I was playing hot potato with a card. You know what I mean? It's like I get it, and it's like, oh, I better get rid of this quick. Oh my God, I better get rid of it. Whereas with the ultra modern, especially, quarterbacks, some of the prospects in the NBA, that kind of thing, it really is like, okay, let me pray he goes out and throws 3 touchdowns this weekend, and the moment he does, I'm throwing this up on eBay because I feel like I overpaid for this card. I need to at least break even on this card, or I'm going to be in for a world of hurting. Like, you don't feel that way. And it's almost like when you said playing the long game is just a bit slower. Like, I feel like ultra modern is the equivalent of, and I'm not trying to be ultra modern versus vintage, but ultra modern is the equivalent of like going to like a loud club with techno music, and going to and collecting vintage is almost like going to the cigar bar. It's just nice and
Yeah.
mellow. It's smoky in there. Guys are maybe drinking glasses of whiskey.
Swapping
There might be
stories.
Exactly. There might be
Yeah.
some jazz playing, like that's the kind of vibe. And there are some people in the hobby, without a doubt, that have to always be involved in flipping. Get it. I totally get it, and probably the cigar lounge isn't for them. But then there's some people that really love cards, love the history of things, love being able to have something, enjoy it, be able to talk and just, have conversations about the card. It's not a pissing contest. And to me, I want to be in the cigar lounge just chilling out.
Yeah, well, your vintage cards probably smell like that too. You know? Rob, there's probably a lot of us vintage guys have probably heard this saying before, but there's a long time saying with vintage that in vintage you make your money on the hold. So like what Pete was saying, is there isn't that sense of urgency because it's over time that you're going to see the appreciation, not investment, but appreciation typically.
Yeah, and some people on the modern side, they want that quick reward, right? So if you hold like a Jalen Hurts card right now, and then you get like this huge bump, like it's awesome, right? But for every one Jalen Hurts, there's 9 or 10 failed quarterbacks, right? Whereas like I agree, like you can flip Babe Ruth, you just can't flip it overnight. You can buy a Gaudy, and then 2 years from now, chances are it's probably up 30 to 40%. Like, so if you want to play a flip game, like just play it that way. Now it's not always guaranteed, but I think that like it's a longer game and it's more patient. The other thing that's fascinating, I think modern people would actually realize this, try selling something vintage that's like a high quality vintage versus a high quality modern. You go to someone and say, hey, I have this Mickey Mantle for sale. Here's where they've traded out. We'll sell it for that price. Modern, it's always like, well, the comps are this. I'll buy it for 70% of comps. I'm like, that's just like, to me, that's just like very annoying. Like I wouldn't want to deal with that over time. Like the vintage, like buying and selling vintage is just so much easier.
Now,
Yeah.
how would you guys, and I know we've talked about this, I think we touched on it on the first roundtable that we did a few months back. How would you guys break down vintage in itself, right? Because I know there like by the year, right? Like there's pre-war, then there's post-war, then there's what's considered vintage. And, like I know some people are like real sticklers, like nothing before 1970 or everything. It has to be before 1970. Everything after 1970 is not. And it's like, well, 1980 was 42 years ago. That sounds like it's vintage to me. So it's like, so I'm kind of curious how you guys feel about this, because really in the hobby, right, there's nothing concrete. There's no governing body. There's no police. There's no rule book to this thing. So it is kind of different for everyone. So when you're talking vintage or just in general pre-war, whatever the case, how would you guys break down the categories of the years?
That's a good question. I mean, first of all, I will just flat out say that I don't think it matters. Like, I mean, it's whatever you want it to be is fine, and everyone has their own definition. For me, I like the breakdown of like where we went from just having tops to having like tops, Donruss, Fleer, right? And I think that that's like 1980 would be considered. I would consider it vintage, but then like 81, where you have like Fleer and Donruss, I wouldn't. But that's like I think that's kind of an old school answer. And for me, I'm mostly focused on because I'm mostly like I like get drawn to the artwork side of things. So I tend to focus like 1956 and earlier because that's the last year it was like illustrations. But I kind of think of vintage as 1980 and earlier, but I don't think it matters. But I'm interested to see what everybody else says.
Yeah.
It's
So
such
those are a few different ideas right there, right? 1980 or earlier, 56 or earlier with the illustrations. Love that idea. You put it very simply. Love it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a very subjective topic, we'll put it that way. I would say almost consider it by sport, in my opinion. It's
Good point.
makes it a little bit difficult. Now, baseball, I consider pre-1980 to be vintage. Hockey, I would consider pre-1985, only because I define Lemieux's set as sort of being the last vintage set. Maybe that's me being a Pittsburgh guy. And then basketball, sort of the 86 Fleer set as being the last set. I know a lot of people like to define it pre-86 Fleer, 1985 and before, just because that's a large set. That's a big set in terms of collectors, things like that.
So
But
that would be what, 1980 then, right? Because it went from 80 to 86 in basketball.
yeah, but I still technically roll the 86 Fleer setup in a vintage. So I would still say 86 and before for basketball, 85 and before for hockey, and then 80 and before for baseball.
Okay.
Adam, you're basing that on Lemieux, right?
That's exactly what.
Yeah.
Just so we're clear.
Yeah.
It's your world, man. You get to make the choice, right? You get
Right.
to choose whatever you want it to be.
Said it was subjective.
So for me, I'm a little funkier on it. 72 and below pretty much on baseball for me, with an honorable mention for 75 for the 75 set. I feel like that was like the last classic kind of vintage design set for that realm. Not that nothing against it. I love the 82 top set. I think that's like a phenomenal baseball set. But that's kind of what I consider vintage. Not that the other stuff isn't necessarily vintage. I kind of view it as vintage light.
Yeah. The beauty of that question is that everyone here, Steve, Adam, Matt, like everyone's right. Like there's no right or wrong answer to what vintage is. My personal opinion is vintage is anything that's not shiny, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, like 20 years from now, some of the refractors of like Jordan in the 90s is going to be vintage, right? Like, so I think it's a moving target. Like that's the beauty. I think when you get bogged down to the argument, like okay, is this part of baseball vintage and not like there's pre-war, there's this and that. It's like it's just I think it's too crazy. I think vintage for me is honestly the answer is if it's just literally not a newish type of card. So is it 80 and back, and then 10 years from now, maybe it's 90 and back. Like I think it has to be a moving target.
Yeah, it's almost like another definition could be like if you go back to think about vintage as being something that is like relatively stable price wise and doesn't vary because of like current events, you would almost define it as like when's the set where the typical player is retired, right?
Yeah.
That's like a moving definition that seems fairly reasonable to me, but I
Yeah,
don't
and
know, not whatever you want.
you're almost breaking it down generational. Like Gen Z,
Mhm.
this is going to be vintage for them. Gen X, this is probably more vintage for them. So, and that's probably going to evolve over time moving forward.
If you ask Net 54, I bet you they would average and say it's 1910. If you ask blowout people, I bet you they'd say it's 1980.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and you
think
get a
you're
lot
right.
of 59s and below too on a lot of the baseball guys.
True,
Mhm.
true.
Yeah. And I think this is all great points, guys. All phenomenal points for sure. Um I'm kind of curious. I don't think this is something that we discussed last time you guys came on, and I know it's been something that I've slowly been I guess accumulating. I've been slowly picking up and adding to my collection. But I am curious, what are your thoughts on in-person on-card autos on vintage cards?
I'll just be real quick. I actually think I think they're awesome, right? I think knowing that it's non-traditional, right? So like you have a card, like let's say Michael Jordan, signs his like a 2000 something exquisite number to 100, like that's fine, but like a more esoteric issue that's autographed is awesome. A Babe Ruth or a Ty Cobb card signed is awesome. And I think they're awesome mostly because the pop reports are so tiny, right? Because signing wasn't really much back then. I also think you can go later stage and find some really interesting cheap vintage opportunities. Like for example, I bought a Gordie Howe autographed 1970 Topps card for like $230, right? Like it's a little bit of a faded auto, but I think that's more interesting to me than buying a Gordie Howe, autographed, 1999 or 2000 upper deck, insert card. Like I think they're rarer, and I think they're really interesting. I think a lot of them are faked, so be
Yeah,
really
yeah.
careful with those in particular. But I think it's a really attractive way to pick them up, and sometimes they're actually pretty decent price.
Yeah, I agree. I think aesthetically, I will be very particular with the type of autograph that I would buy. We'll put it that way. But
Mhm.
I think that if you have a personal attachment to a player or a card, it's an even greater way to heighten that personal attachment because it's as if you have a piece of history that was then touched and autographed, signed by the player who's also a piece of history. So it's sort of like duplicity or whatever of historical events. So I think it's really cool. But I think it's a great way to have a super personal type connection to a card.
Yeah, growing up out here, we had a lot of spring training, so I was a total autograph hound, and we had a AAA team. So I was like autograph fanatic as a kid, just getting everybody signed. So I have a super soft spot for that stuff. So on card auto that you got yourself in person, like can't be beat. So if you're going back and wanting a vintage person like that, I'd much rather find a vintage card, even though you didn't get it signed yourself, that was signed than getting a more modern reissue, which is such taboo because when we all grew up, a lot of us grew up collecting in the 80s and stuff. You were considered that you destroyed the card by having it signed. You just ruined the value. What are you doing? You know, so it's crazy how that paradigm is flipped.
Yeah, I feel like I when I look at my collection, I do like a little bit of both, right? I like in-person autographs on cards, but I also like I'm a big chaser of the Ernie Banks autographed cards from Topps Heritage before he died, which were kind of like, reprint cards that then he autographed. I chase those things like crazy, but I also, like to buy in-person autographs. But like Adam, it really depends on like the card and like how the autograph was placed. Like one of the coolest cards I think I've seen on Instagram is someone has I think it's a green Cobb that was autographed with a fountain
Oh yeah,
pen. It's
that's
gorgeous.
awesome.
It's so pretty. And you can definitely tell that it's a fountain pen. So cool.
That's the one I picked up from PWCC.
There it
Oh,
is. That's
Get
oh
out of
man.
here. Oh my
That's
god.
an amazing card. I mean, so cool. The
Yeah.
fountain pen. So
Yeah.
cool.
That's a work of art.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's like those are the things where you just like the fountain pen and just knowing that's history, and there's probably like a couple that are signed you'll ever find. Like those, they're phenomenal. You can't put a price on that.
Pete was like, yeah, that was
Is
me.
FYI.
He's like,
Drop the
exactly.
mic.
You can drop the mic and log off now.
See you guys. This is fun.
See you guys later.
Oh, I think Pete's breaking up here.
But yeah, I love the idea of same, I think, as you guys, and I've slowly started to pick up some of these on card autos of in players that, like you guys said, low pop, and if you can find them, I love the idea. I'll show you, just in the last few months I picked up the Mattingly on card auto.
Oh yeah,
This is only an 84, right? It only cost
That's
me a
pretty
couple
cool.
$100. It
yeah,
was only
but
a couple $100.
that's a grail card for so many of us that grew up that time.
Definitely. Got the LT, rookie that's autographed that,
So
I
nice.
felt good about. And then, another cool one is the Bill Russell in action from 61 Fleer
yeah.
autograph. That's only a pop 18, this Bill Russell. So that was something cool that I got. So, that being more expensive, obviously, than the other ones, but I do like the idea of when I'm curating my collection and it's vintage. It's so strange because in the ultra modern world, right? Like, you could get a Justin Herbert in person on card auto of, whatever, and that'll go for about $300. But a sticker auto of a Justin Herbert will sell for $5K. But the in person goes for 300. It's almost like it's considered junk. And to go back to what you guys were saying, back in the 80s, 90s, maybe, the purists, if that's what you want to call them, would say, what are you doing? You're defacing that card. And but like you guys said, it's like, that player actually touched that card, which is something that's really cool.
The archival side of me on preservation always goes towards like the refractor cards or the sticker cards. Is what is the long-term archival preservation aspect of these going to be 20, 30 years down? Are we going to get the yellow toning? Are we going to get we don't really know what processes they're using on that stuff to see how archivally well that stuff is. Is it totally acid free? How is it going to hold up? I know a lot of the refractors started yellowing big time, that were the early basketball ones. So
yeah, they
that
were actually greening. I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And they would call it hulking. So
So
like 96 Topps Chrome, 97 Topps Chrome basketball, a lot of that. But they were trying really creative things, at that time. I mean, some of these insert sets from the 90s are just incredible. And you talk about artwork, it's some of that is, they were trying to really, jumpstart the hobby, I think, in terms of getting out of that junk wax era, that just like 92 upper deck, 93 score, kind of thing. But
I would just
taken though.
I would just be concerned about that on my end long term, right? So I think an on card would hold up better.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So all right. So we are almost at the 50-minute mark. I have no idea where that 50 minutes went. So the conversation that we started with was, what would be a good entry? But well, let me ask you guys, because this has kind of been on my mind. Do you feel like when it comes to vintage, do you feel like and I know there's exceptions with certain cards, right? The iconic certain cards, but do you get the feeling that maybe the 70s and 80s are kind of just like overlooked? Like there's not a ton of great vintage in those decades, or would someone be wrong to say that?
Oh, not at all. I don't think so. I think the George Brett rookie was the 52 mantle of most of us 80 kid collectors. And then you throw in something like a 71 Garvey for any of the West Coast guys. That was a huge card. So then you had the Schmidt rookie. You got the Yount rookie. I don't know. There was a lot of good good rookies up through 80, 85 even. And the 87 had some good ones too. But yeah, I would say on the 70s stuff, there's some pretty good rookie classes in there.
I mean, I think for me, it's all about like the design, the card design, and like I have just a personal connection to the 80s cards because like that's when I grew up. So when I see like 86 tops, I'm like, wow, that's such a cool design. And I love, if you look at like whatever, like the Bo Jackson tops traded card, like that's a really cool looking card. I mean, I think there's so many places where they're really, I mean, from one point of view, those cards are relatively inexpensive. So you can find nicely graded cards like PSA 8, PSA 9 of Ryan Sandberg from, 1986 tops. That's going to be like $30. And so, if you have a connection to the players or the designs in that era, I think it's a great place to really explore, maybe taking a step away from modern, but, not spending a lot of money. I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Totally. Also, if you're buying it graded for less than it would cost you to grade it, like you really aren't down anything, but you're not paying anything for the card.
Yeah, and I tell you what, you can without a doubt go on eBay and find a ton of graded 80s stuff, a ton of graded 70s stuff for probably, like you guys are saying, $20 or less for sure. Yeah, and if you're a team collector, a set collector, this was just a conversation. I'm going to completely shift the conversation somewhere else because of my selfish ways. But right now, what I'm doing is I've been set building a 51 Bowman, right? 51 Bowman set. I have the big card. I'm working on getting the second biggest card, the Maze, but I probably have I'm probably about 35% done with the set. It's a big set, so probably about 30, maybe almost halfway done. And I'm considering sending it in for grading. I'm considering either SGC or I'm considering PSA if they come down to $15 for vintage, because they've already come down to $15. They're at $15 right now for all non-sports cards and for anything 96 and newer.
Wow.
So
yeah,
crazy, right? So it's like, so I had been wondering, do you think if someone can even get their hands on some of these commons from some of these sets, 51 Bowman, 52 tops, 54 Bowman, anything like that, would it be worth grading some of these cards if the grading goes back down to $15? What would you guys think?
So this is how I would think about it. So number one, you got to remember that from like a resale standpoint, commons are really only going to get picked up by set collectors. And in a big drive on the set collector side is the registry. So that's a major advantage for PSA, right? People want to be able to like set collect. They want to be able to like pull those into their registry and have it acknowledge that, okay, I have a complete set of 51 Bowman. I mean, the way that I personally look at it is that I really stay away from grading commons unless I think that it's going to land at a pretty high grade, just because it's pretty cost prohibitive, even if it's at like that $10-15 level. And for me, what I would probably try to do I think that grading is great for a preservation point of view. But from like a resale point of view for a common, I think it's pretty tough. I probably wouldn't do it personally.
Matt, I totally agree with you. I think if you're collecting, you're not flipping. I think the preservation value is worth, and to be able to put it on your shelf, I think that value is so tangible versus like calculating how it would cost to resale. I think if you're doing a set or you're looking to grade some of these cards, like you don't have to always think about, okay, is this plus what I paid for going to get me an exit value? I think you have to also think of like aesthetically, like, do I want my cards graded and preserved and more easy to like show on a wall? So I think I would personally, if I wasn't looking to flip them, I would get them graded and not care that if I was losing money on the resale eventually.
Adam, what do you think?
I think there'll be an obvious inflection point once you hit a particular set. So obviously, as the cost of grading, let's say vintage in bulk, has increased from, I don't know if it was $8 or $9 pre-pandemic. Now we're talking about 18. Every single graded card has not shifted up in value $10. So sort of to Matthew's point, in my opinion, it has to be a card that's going to grade high enough to at least be equal to or greater than the $18 that you're going to send. Now, what I would say was, if you have a set, let's just say Rob's 51 Bowman set, it's where the majority of the set is already raw, you have it in binders, and that's how you've had your set for a while, I would probably keep it at that point. Now, if you started graded and you're building out a graded set for the PSA registry, then it's probably worth it. I mean, I personally just sent 90 56 tops in at the National that I'm hoping to finally have back next week. That unless they realistically got sevens, which I was hoping that they would, they weren't going to be worth the grading cost that I put into them. But from my side, I was 25 cards from finishing the set. So with me being that close and having all graded cards, of course, it made sense. But I think that if the majority of your set's already raw and maybe you're just trying to do the Hall of Fame cards or the big cards graded from that set, I would probably just stick to that.
So now you officially have a full 1956 graded set, all PSA?
I do not. So I think out of my 90 cards, 3 or 4 will go into the set, and the rest will either have to be sold off or pieced out. I had bought these cards a couple years ago and had forgot to send them in prior to the price increase. And then when it dropped to 18, I just decided to send them in bulk. But I think this gets me close to 13 or 14 cards left in the set. So it'll get me at least some.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that for my 1956 top set, only the Hall of Famers and some of the team cards I have graded. Everything else is raw. I like that library smell, right? I think that makes it fun.
So Rob,
Yeah.
Rob, are you thinking of it for like more of a display purposes or preservation purpose, or just to have the full set fully graded?
I think it wouldn't be for display. That would be way too many cards to display. I think it would probably be more of an investment. And I mean like long-term investment. Just like you said, the money is in the hold, right? So I'm thinking, 20, 30 years from now, maybe type thing. But I think about so I had a guy on Brian, he's Cajun Cardboard on Instagram and YouTube and stuff like that, and he told me about how in like 2017, 2018, it took him about a year, and he completely built a 1986 Fleer NBA basketball set. 1986 Fleer, all PSA 10s. Every single card, including stickers, PSA 10s. So I actually had him on my show probably about 3 or 4 months ago, and we spent about an hour, the entire episode. I picked his brain. There wasn't a question I didn't ask him, and there wasn't a question he didn't answer. It was incredible, the episode. He said it took him about 10 months. Took him about 10 months to do, and this was pre-pandemic, and the entire thing cost him $140,000 to do. And at one point during the boom, he had a $2 million offer that he turned down.
Wow.
He turned down, and then slowly, the value just slowly started going down. And but I mean, I didn't ask him, well, how much did you make in the end? I didn't ask him that, but he ended up selling a bunch of them on Golden. And I remember one of the cards was a Kareem sticker that I think sold for like $300K or something like that. Obviously it was a set builder, that probably bought that really needed that Kareem. But I'm sure he did fine, but he told me he just absolutely regretted not selling at that time. So I think, when we're talking about the kind of money that we spend on cards, I say this a lot in my podcast, I think it would be irresponsible of me to not think long term, not think of it as an investment, try to be smart with it, because if I didn't think about it like an investment, I would probably have 50 Ken Griffey Jr. Upper Deck rookie on card autos for no reason, just because that was my chase card as a kid, and I never had enough money to get it. I always had to
I would think if I was in your spot then and doing that, then I would just try to focus on any pickups, commons, or whatever being graded, but getting them graded, buying them graded at a raw or ungraded price. So
Smart. Yeah.
if the average price is $17 for raw ungraded, if you get a graded one for 15 to $20, then go that route. Then you're
Yeah.
building it along the way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I definitely have seen people, have known people who build sets to try to sell sets, and rarely do I see a set incomplete, you getting as much money out of that as you would individual cards.
Yeah.
So I think if your goal is to build a set and try to make money off of it, it's probably not the greatest money-making endeavor, to be truthful. I think it's more just an appreciation of the set. You want to have the set for a long-term hold. You like the players, you like the cards, whatever the case might be. But unless it's going to grade high, we'll put it that way, in most cases, you're probably not going to make a lot of money off grading an entire set.
One thing I think about too is like, with vintage, we talk about like long-term hold, right? You're holding this card for like 20, 30 years. What's going to happen to grading in that time frame? It's unlikely to me that like the situation we're in now will look the same in 20 years. Very unlikely, right? And so it's kind of like, for me, when I think about the commons in my 1956 set, like, it's right now, it's really not at the place where, even from like an archival point of view, it makes sense for me to try to grade them, right? So it's an interesting thing to think about, right? If you're holding it for 20 years, there could be differences, major changes in technology that make grading a lot better or a lot different. And maybe you
or
have
a
to
lot
resubmit them all. Yeah,
could
or
make
a
them a
lot
lot
cheaper.
cheaper.
Yeah, and to your point, Matthew, I think artificial intelligence and computers that's probably the way that grading is going to be going. You look at tag grading, who's Jeremy Lee is high up with the company. He's a friend of mine. He's talked to me about the grading company, and just they're doing great things over there. I think they they grade like 50 different parts of your card on a scale from 0 to 1,000, basically. And then on every single card you grade with them, you get a full printout report as to why that was graded. But he says that they're not so strict to where like a PSA 9 would be like a tag 5. He said, because then no one would grade with them if all their cards were coming back terribly graded. So there are some like, they figured out a way to like get it close to like what current grading standards and current grades get to, but at the same time it's a lot more detailed as to why you're getting the grade you're getting. So yeah, I think the question would be, 20, 30 years from now, is a PSA 10 going to be looked at as like, something incredible, like a unicorn, or is it going to be looked at like, yeah, I'm not buying that PSA 10. That would be a tag 7 right now. Get that out of my face, So
I think I would I think I would view it maybe like allocate what you're thinking of in your budget of building the complete set all graded. I would take that extra amount there, let's say $2,500, whatever you're thinking of there, and apply that towards your budget on one of the key cards. Maybe bump your budget up on buying a stronger maze, or one of the key cards there, and leave the lower tier stuff raw.
Yeah.
The thing I'll say about grading is, first of all, it's so much more fun complaining about graders than it would be a computer. So if I got a bad computer grade, I'm like, oh, this damn tag computer messed me up. Like, it's more fun to be like, oh, PSA, SGC, this grader was had a bad day. Like, how could you guys do this to my card? The second thing I'll say is for vintage, right? A lot of the cards, for it to be affordable, you have to purchase like a 2 grade or a 1 or a 3. So like, no matter what technology is going forward, it's not like a 2 or a 3 is going to be a 6 or whatever. I'd be more nervous about the modern side, right? So because the modern side, a difference between a 9 and a 10 is tremendous. I think of the 86 Flair Jordan, right? So I'd be more nervous if I was more modern. I had a 10 grade. fortunately for us vintage folks, like
Yeah.
10s are just not. It's like, what is a 10? I don't
Mm.
understand what's perfect. We're more lower end grades. Like Rob, look at your like the 2 in your Gaudy background. Like that's going to be a 2 or 3 or a 1 for however anyone grades it anywhere 20 years from now. So it's kind of comforting being on the vintage side because I think the grading issues in the future we're just not have to worry about.
Yeah, there's not that pressure for a 9 or a 10. Like we don't expect that out of the gate.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and very well said, guys. And you know, we probably spent way too much time talking about me potentially building my 51 Bowman because at this point I'm probably just pipe dreaming. It's going to be at least probably a 5-year project for me. But I did just pick up 7 random commons at a card show in New Jersey last week. It was like I saw he had vintage and I'm like, you know, do you have any
Nice.
51 Bowmans? And I almost walked away before he could answer because I figured he didn't. He's like, yeah, I think I got a couple in there. Pulled out 7 of them. I think I got 7 of them for $15.
That's
Oh,
awesome.
that's cool.
That's
I was like,
awesome.
awesome. I was like, great. You
Hey,
know,
Rob, I've never.
Hmm?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I wasn't gonna say
I've never used tag grading before, but I'm intrigued by their slabs because I kind of like how limited the colors and the stuff are. How it's the white font and it's clear up above. So I think
Yeah.
presentation wise for cards, like how SGC really makes them pop. I think the tag slabs, the minimalistic design that they have on there, could be very visually appealing on a lot of cards, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, very well said, man. Very well said. So, hour 6 minutes. We started off the conversation saying what's a good entry point for getting into vintage. Now, I asked you guys to bring a card with you that could be a good entry point for people that you're happy with, you're feeling good about, because I think a lot of people feel like vintage can price you out. So let's see what you guys got. And we could start counterclockwise. Adam, do you want to start off?
Yeah, let's get her kicked off. All right, so I'm going to sort of go off of my personal experience and I guess how I got started in vintage. Now, the cards that I'm going to show obviously were not the first type card or the first example of that card that I bought. But I'll start off here. So I think one of the big ways to get in, this is a 1970 tops. Let's see if we can get an area where it's not as 1970.
Clemente.
Okay. So this is a 7. I built up 2 7s. I think when I started buying the Clementes, they were 4s or 5s, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the easiest things to do is basically, if there's a particular player that you like, start building a run of that player. And it doesn't necessarily have to start off with a rookie. I mean, the 55 Clemente is very, very expensive. You could do 60s Clementes. You could do 70s Clementes. Well, I mean, whatever you want. Sort of start off small and then build up from there. And obviously buy lower grades, high eye appeal, buy raw if you want to. I mean, when I first started buying, I had a mix of vintage and raw. They weren't all PSA. They were a mix of BVG even. Honestly, I had some Beckett cards. So just start small and build up from there. I mean, it's easy to get intimidated when it comes to vintage, but there's definitely a lot of entry points that are affordable. So that's one way to do it. The real way that I got started in vintage was the 56 Tops set. Something about the aesthetics of the set really appealed to me. The players that are in the set, I loved it. So there's a few different ways that you could sort of go about, let's say, a particular type set. If you like the aesthetics on it, you could build out the Hall of Famers of the set. So this is a 56 Tops Bob Feller. I love Bob Feller's card. Something about it. I don't know if it's the way the guy looked. I don't know what it is, but I love his cards. So you
awesome card.
Collecting the Hall of Famers of a particular type set. That's a great way to do it. So here is a 56 Tops.
Oh yeah.
So you could also do the rookies of a particular decade or era. Rookies of a set, you could do that as well. Obviously, he is the only Hall of Fame rookie in this particular type set. A lot of people like to collect Hall of Fame rookies. So you could do something along those lines. And then the third one that I have is a 56 Tops Yogi Berra.
Oh, awesome.
So teams, we talked about teams you have an attachment to. I have a random run of 1971 Tops Pirates. 71 top sets, but it has to do with the year that they won the World Series. So if you like Yankees, I mean, this is the World Series team from 56. You could start with something like that. build out the Yankees team. Obviously, you're going to have to pay for some of the higher end players, but some of the lower end guys don't really cost a lot. And a lot of these can be sort of long-term goals. I think it's really important to have both sort of long-term and short-term goals when it comes to collecting. Your short-term goals may be bigger cards, bigger players that are going to cost you a lot. But as you sort of space out those purchases because you don't have the money, you're going to get a collecting itch. Just honestly looking at cards all the time, we all get itches where we need to buy a new card. So I think that's where it's important to have sort of subsets, things like that. I mean, for me, I collect a lot of pre-war, but I also collect the 56 top set. So I can pick up these random commons sort of in between my bigger purchases that, hey, suffice, sort of make me happy. It's ironic, even Rob talked about picking up 7 random cards at a show. People that he may never even heard of, or the case might be. It's kind of ironic getting excited about picking up a guy you've never heard of. But if it sort of fits your collecting goals or needs at the time, then it makes you feel happy. So, I mean, obviously a lot about this hobby just sort of making you feel happy. But that's what I got.
Awesome, Adam. Awesome. All right, so I'm next in line here. So first card I'm going to show is this guy. This is a T205 Mordecai Brown.
Gorgeous.
So
Oh man,
yeah,
Gorgeous
this
card.
is a fun card. So this is, I mean, this is a Hall of Famer, right? Mordecai Brown was a Chicago Cubs pitcher back in the days when the Cubs were really good, right? So this is around like 1910. I got this card because a project that I started was I'm going to collect a Cubs card from every major set from T206 to 1991 tops.
Wow.
That was a super fun project. And in that project, I think there was only one card that was more than $500, and that was the Ernie Banks rookie card. Everything else was easily under $500. And this Mordecai Brown card it's just super cool. It's a really fun image on the back of it. So T206 had on the back of it, you can't really see it. Sorry about that. T206, there you go. T206 had like cigarette ads on the back, but T205 has like little biography. So that's kind of cool. But you know, in collecting that project, I got exposed to like all kinds of different players. You know, I was reading a lot of Wikipedia about different things, and right, Mordecai Brown, his nickname was Three Finger Brown. Right, he had his pitching hand mangled in a farm injury as a child, so he lost one of his fingers, and another finger was kind of like curled in a crazy way, but it allowed him to pitch like crazy balls, basically. So like, if you look at his pitching stats, they're insane. And there's a bar across the street from Wrigley Field that's called like Mordecai's Pub. So I mean, he's a really cool guy, super old, but you know, that's a card you can get for under $500. He's a Hall of Famer. That's a classic set. So I think that was one I wanted to show. Another one I wanted to show really quickly here. This is 1952 Topps Lucius Luke Easter. So this card was a project that I started that was, I want to collect all of the first African-American players to join baseball. So I just looked at Wikipedia, who were the very first players. Of course, you've got like Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby, Roy Campanella, the Hall of Famers, but there are also a lot of players that you probably haven't heard of. So Luke Easter was a player for the Indians, and this guy was like massive. This guy was like 6'4", like 250. He was huge. And, you know, there are a lot of quotes that you can read about him, that he could hit a baseball, you know, as long as Babe Ruth. And I think someone asked him one time, I saw your longest home run. And then he asked them, oh, well, did it come down? And they said, yeah. And then he said, that wasn't the longest one. So I think he has a number of like, at different stadiums of having hit like the longest home run. And so, you know, that's a 1952 Topps card from when the greatest sets ever created. It's Luke Easter, this guy with all these amazing stories about him. That card was a PSA 6, and I think I bought it for $70. So, you know, there's just a lot of cool cards you can get from really classic sets, well under the $500 mark. So those are the two that I brought.
Love it. I love the whole idea of getting one Cubs card from every single set. I love it. I have
was super fun.
To borrow that idea.
It was a really fun project.
Matthew, what'd you get for the 33 Gowdy, Kyler?
Gabby Hartnett.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good.
The Loman and the Monin. Yeah. Really fun cards.
So first of all, so if anyone wants to know who are the most passionate collectors out there, just like listening to Steve, Adam, and Matthew, like it's vintage people. Like this is from the first round table, so I just want to say that like I don't think anyone can match our nerdy passion in the hobby. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is, so I wanted to go ultra low end, right? And so for an example, if you're in the city, it costs $25-$30 for a mixed drink plus tip, right? Or you could dive into the most iconic set of all time and get a low grade beater.
I love the lead in for that.
So moral of the story: everyone stay home, buy one less drink, and then just get yourself into T206, right? So here's a card here that I found actually in my drawer, right? So
cool.
It's got creases, right? It's Boston. Nice, a really nice in action pose, right? Has the Piedmont, which is a more common back, right? But you know what? Like this costs $30 and is a great cheap toe hold into a fascinating set and into a fascinating like vintage hobby, right? So you don't have to go crazy. It doesn't need to be a Hall of Famer, but you can tell yourself, hey, I have a card that came from one of the best sets ever. So that's the only card I wanted to show. It just shows you like $30 can get you a nice card and a nice set, right? Like you don't have to like spend hundreds of dollars. Like you can spend $30 and find something great.
That's awesome. And instead of hangover, you have happiness.
Well, I mean, I was going to say, if you buy a few more drinks, you'll really get into it.
My problem is if I bought a few more drinks, the budget would get another zero.
There you go.
Let's see. Boy, I'm debating on which ones I want to show you here. So I guess I'll go with 48 Leaf Wagner.
Great card. Great card.
It's a low grade. It's only a 1.5, but it's an opportunity to pick up a prevalent key pre-war Hall of Famer. And of course, we all know the T206 is always ever going to be linked as one of the hobby card. And you could get the 48 Leaf is a very iconic set. You can get a post playing day card of a great like Wagner on that end in a lower grade for a couple $100. There's obviously much more cost effective ones, but you could focus on some sets like that are still very iconic sets, but maybe they have a Ruth like the top scoops, 54 scoops or something like that. Or the Look and Sees, and look at some options there. Maybe if you wanted to get a Ruth or a Gehrig or a Wagner or a Cobb and you just didn't have that type of budget, but you wanted to own something vintage of those guys, not maybe plain era vintage, but vintage. One other one I had was for another idea of 500 and below was the 52 Bowman Mini Minoso rookie.
Awesome card.
Yeah, thank you. If you focused on Hall of Fame rookie cards within your budget, so if your budget was $200 and you wanted to collect 69 and below, if you just focused on rookie card Hall of Famers within your budget and just bought those guys like Tony, I can't remember. I think Tony Perez is in now. But if you went for like a Perez rookie, if you went for things like that, you could build something affordable, and you're always having a key card that's linked to any set builders or anything because it's a rookie.
Yeah, it was like the Aparicio that Adam showed. Same.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Wow.
I feel like we're gonna have to rename this the Dances with Wolves Vintage podcast. We're going long here. we're at the 118 mark.
What was that 6 hours, that movie? How long was
I
it?
don't know. I just remember it was about 3.5 hours.
3.5
hours.
Okay, yeah.
How many times did you fall asleep? That's the answer.
So a couple cards that I brought that I just wanted to show quickly. So this was actually something that I just picked up, not technically a pack pulled card or anything like that, but I think I had mentioned it in the vintage group chat that we're in. It's the 1933 Sinella Babe Ruth.
Very cool.
So yeah, it's a German, right? Sinella is an actual margarine company. Now, so an SGC1 I saw just sold for $505 within the last few weeks. So an SGC one just sold for $500. So that's something. I also brought a 1948 Bowman Phil Rizzuto.
Oh yeah,
Yep.
Awesome.
Love Rizzuto. Love
great card.
yeah. And so this is a PSA 3. I think I got this for $250. So, can't go wrong with that. I'm a sucker for iconic vintage cards. So, the show I was at just a couple weeks ago or last week, I actually picked up this, which is the
Reggie.
Reggie Jackson
Reggie.
rookie. This is a great looking PSA 1. It just has slight paper loss going along the right side of the card. So, PSA 1, and I
Real nice.
got this for $60.
Oh man,
60
So
bucks.
cool.
And then vintage, not vintage, depending on who you ask. 1981 Topps Joe Montana rookie, PSA 8. I got this in a deal that was a bigger deal that I made, and I told him he could throw this in the mix. I think this is like a $350 card in a PSA 8. So I'm a sucker for iconic rookies. So I don't even care what the pop counts are. I don't even care.
yeah.
Just, for me, it's like, if it's something that I remember seeing growing up,
Yep.
if it's something that hits me right in the feels, that's what I want.
And I think it points to if looking at like 80s cards with a real like vintage eye, right? PSA 8, that's an awesome grade. That's a really high grade card. Like you don't need, is it really necessary to like pay more to get like a 10 or even a 9, right? That's
A
where
9, I think, is like 10x what an 8 is.
Yeah. So see,
And
there you
I
go.
bet if you pull the Maddie C and put them up side by side, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Exactly. So it's just like, collecting 80s cards, collecting 90s cards with that like eye appeal approach. I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, and I think the longer you hold that stuff and the deeper you go down into your vintage collection and your appreciation grows for it, the price point you paid or the price you're paying becomes less relevant. Like, so you got the Montana like that, or you got the Reggie at $60. Like you're just never going to regret that. There's like no downside there. So it's a PSA 1. You're going to know, people might try to beat you up on it or whatever in your mind, or you might say, oh, it's only a 1, but you're never going to feel bad about that. It's like there's not any downside to that card if it has good eye appeal for what it is,
Yeah.
So it just becomes less important what you paid or what you're in it, and more about what it's evoking with you.
Yeah. Pete, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was make the Matty C comment. He wouldn't never put side by side a 9 and an 8. It'd be a 9 and a 1 or a 9 and an A. So just a small clarification.
I know. Listen, I tell you though, it's such food for thought though when you look at him and you're like, oh my God, like he is right. Like the premium, and that's what I just feel like, and I'm just trying not to knock ultra modern or modern collectors, but it just really feels like the mind of the vintage collector is so much more evolved, because we base things strictly, for the most part, I shouldn't say, because Maddie C brings up good points of overpaying for mantles all day, right? But the vintage collector, it's like their eye is trained to just go with what they see, not so much what the grade is. And we've seen that when an SGC 3 will sell for higher than a PSA 5 of the same card. And it's like,
But
whoa, what happened there? And then people are like, oh, it's because SGC is really coming up and they're getting more. It's like, no, it's not. It has not. Listen, it's because of the eye appeal, strictly because the eye appeal.
yeah, I totally agree. I think it's because it's so much of vintage collecting is connection, and so much of it is about how it feels in your hand, and that's where the eye appeal part matters, and the price part doesn't as much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well said, Steve.
Yeah. And so Yeah, this has been a great episode, a great roundtable, vintage 101. So I might as well throw it out here first. I'm going to be doing and it's either going to be a really popular night or a really dead night. I don't know. But I did the IG live, the vintage IG live at the beginning of the month, which was incredible. Had some great people on. Some of you guys were on, showed off some amazing cards. So what I'm planning on doing is doing that to see just kind of where it goes. I'm going to be doing it once a month, last Saturday of every month. So I haven't. This last Saturday of this month is New Year's Eve, so I don't know if it's going to be really dead or really live on the IG live. So I don't. I might end up starting that in January. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Last Saturday of every month, but just throwing that out there, guys, because the appreciation that you guys have for vintage and the vintage community has for their cards is absolutely second to none. And just I just feel so much better about cards and about the hobby. I feel like personally when I'm immersed in vintage. So, um, throwing that out there, last Saturday of every month, I'm gonna try doing the IG live for vintage collectors. And so if you're a listener,
Sounds fun.
yeah, it was. Thank you. And I mean, you guys were phenomenal. I didn't do anything. It was just all about the presenters, and there was just some amazing cards. I had Ben Jordan with his Ty Cobbs. Matty C with his mantles. Just unbelievable. I mean,
Yeah,
every
man,
single person.
you got to get Pete to show his auto his signed Ty Cobb.
Oh, that'd be
that's
awesome.
a monster.
Does it exist? I don't know. I mean, he doesn't have it with us. So no.
Rob, I'm happy to do the next one. That'd be awesome.
That would be amazing. Listen, that would truly set the bar to where no one would probably ever be able to get over. There's nothing that you'd be able to present that would top an on-card auto Ty Cobb.
I expect like the guy who carries the Stanley Cup who wears the white
Yeah,
glove.
absolutely.
Totally.
Oh man. Well, guys, listen, it was great having you on. Adam, do you want to let us know one more time before we wrap up how they could reach out to you if they'd like to?
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody that wants to reach out at Wise Guy Sports Cards on Instagram.
I'm Matthew at 1956 Topps Guy on Instagram, and if you ever want to chat about vintage, you want to think about different kinds of directions, I'm happy to chat with you.
Yep, I'm Sports Card Pete. So yeah, same as Matthew. Like, DM me if you have any questions about vintage market.
Yep, and Steve at Vintage Slamman IG, and same thing as Matthew and Pete. The only thing that I would say is if you're reaching out, like, totally happy to answer questions and help and be totally open on that. But like my time is not to make you money per se. So if you're only asking me stuff just to flip on your end and that type of stuff, like, you gotta have to learn that on your own. If you're wanting to dig into the collecting side and really like follow vintage, hey, I'll talk all day long with you on that. That's all.
Love it. Well, Steve, we were worried you weren't going to be able to come on. You were saying that, because we originally planned to record last night, and then you weren't sure if the warden was going to let you out. And
yeah, man, I chewed off the ankle bracelet and got out here, man. I think I hear the hound dogs coming. So.
All right, guys. Well, if you are listening this late, an hour, 30 minutes into it, thank you very much, guys, for listening. Steve, Pete, Matthew, Adam, thank you for coming on, guys. It was a pleasure. And to everyone out there listening, take care of yourself and your collection. Have a good one, guys.
Thanks for having us, Rob.